Picture this. It's 1975. The world is still riding the high of the jumbo jet era, that feeling that bigger automatically meant better, that if you could dream it large enough, you could sell it. Engineers and designers everywhere were asking the same question with the same confidence. How far can we push this before something stops us? And in Stuttgart, Germany, one team didn't just ask the question. They built the answer. Nearly 60 feet of articulated, double-deck road coach. A machine so large it had to be sized to the legal millimeter just to exist on public road. The Neoplan Jumbocruiser. And here's the thing. It didn't fail because the engineering was sloppy. It didn't fail because the idea was stupid. It failed fast, brutally, and publicly, for reasons that had almost nothing to do with how well it was built. By the time the dust settled, only 10 of these things existed on the entire planet. And one accident, caused by a cup of coffee, killed the whole project. That's the story we're getting into today. This is Forgotten Chassis, and I spend way too much time thinking about the engineering ambitions that almost changed transportation forever. If you're someone who loves digging into the vehicle's history forgot too quickly, the ones that pushed limits and paid the price, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now, before we get into the fall, we need to understand the climb. Because the Jumbocruiser didn't appear out of nowhere. It was the end result of a very deliberate, very serious engineering progression that started more than a decade earlier. And the beginning of that progression sits with one man and one thesis that most people in the industry thought sounded reckless. The year is 1964. Konrad Auwarter, connected directly to Neoplan's leadership, writes an academic thesis that centers on an idea considered borderline irresponsible at the time. A high-speed, long-distance double-decker coach. Not a city bus moving slowly through tight street. A highway machine. Something meant to cruise at speed, carry passengers in real comfort, and do it all while sitting 2 stories tall. The immediate reaction from the industry wasn't curiosity. It was doubt, and that doubt had a very specific shape. Stability. Put that much mass up high, get it moving at highway speeds, and people immediately picture what happens in crosswinds. They picture sway. They picture a rollover waiting for the right corner. And in 1964, those concerns weren't unreasonable. Nobody had done it seriously at that scale. Nobody had proven the physics worked in real-world conditions. The skepticism was genuine, and in some ways, it was fair. But here's what most people don't realize about how Neoplan operated. They didn't respond to doubt with arguments. They responded with proof. In 1967, 3 years after that thesis stirred up the conversation, Neoplan rolled out a working prototype they called the Dobus. And they didn't just park it outside a trade show and hand out brochures. They sent it on a real journey. Stuttgart to Brussels. With journalists on board. With industry experts in the seat. With the whole thing playing out in real traffic, on real roads, under real conditions. The message was deliberate and confident. You don't believe this works? Fine. Come ride it. By the time the coach reached Belgium, the tone had shifted. Skepticism had turned into momentum. Orders started arriving. And Neoplan gave the concept a name that would carry weight for years. The Skyliner. That name became a product line, and that product line evolved fast. It stretched into 3-axle configurations. It offered multiple interior layouts. It climbed into higher trim levels for operators who wanted to position their service as something premium. The Skyliner wasn't just a bus. It was a statement about what coach travel could be. And for a window of years in the late 1960s and into the early 70s, it was working exactly as intended. But success, real success, creates its own pressure. Because once the Skyliner was out there performing and operators were seeing what double-deck capacity could do for revenue, the next question became obvious. Not can this work, but how much further can it go? Customers didn't just want a better coach anymore. They wanted more seats. More passengers per trip meant more revenue per mile, and in the economics of long-distance coach operation, that math matters enormously. According to industry data from that period, European long-distance coach ridership was climbing steadily through the early 1970s, driven in part by fuel costs making air travel comparatively expensive for shorter continental routes. The pressure to maximize capacity per vehicle wasn't abstract. It was a real commercial driver pushing operators to ask their suppliers for more. And Neoplan, riding the momentum of the Skyliner's success, decided to answer that demand in the most literal way possible. They gave themselves roughly 1 year. 1 year to take the Skyliner's core concept, the high-speed double-deck coach, and push it to its absolute physical extreme. The result, unveiled in 1975, was the Jumbocruiser. And the engineering choices they made tell you exactly how seriously they took the challenge and exactly how much confidence they had walking into it. The approach wasn't to start from scratch. Neoplan extended what they already knew worked. The Skyliner's double-deck architecture was the foundation. What changed was the addition of an articulated joint, a pivoting connection that allowed a second section to be attached behind the main coach body. That rear section functioned essentially like a built-in trailer, adding roughly 20 additional feet of passenger-carrying space behind the joint. And this is where the ambition becomes really visible. They didn't just add length for the sake of it. They built the entire package right up to the legal maximum dimensions. Every centimeter was accounted for. The whole machine was sized so precisely to the regulatory ceiling that it could claim the title of largest road coach of its time with documented, verifiable specificity. This wasn't marketing rounding. This was engineering to the limit on purpose. The spec sheet is worth walking through in detail, because on paper this thing is genuinely extraordinary. Length came in at approximately 59 feet, which is 18 meters. Width ran to roughly 8 feet 2 inches, or 2.5 meters. Height reached about 13 feet 1 inch, sitting at 4 meters. Curb weight was quoted at approximately 39,700 pounds, which converts to 18,000 kilograms, and the permitted gross vehicle weight came in near 61,700 pounds, or 28,000 kilograms. The turning circle was listed at around 79 feet, or 24 meters. That last number matters more than it might seem, and we'll come back to it. Power was not an afterthought. Sources identify the primary engine as a Mercedes-Benz OM404 AV12 configuration, which was serious hardware for a road coach of that era. The final example built used a different unit, an OM442 LAV8, and output across the variants is described in the range of 400 to 500 horsepower. Look, for context, a standard long-distance coach of the mid-1970s was typically running somewhere between 200 and 300 horsepower. Putting a V12 under a bus wasn't a casual decision. It reflected the real weight and performance demands of moving nearly 28,000 kilograms at highway speed with any kind of responsiveness. Then there's the capacity question, and this is where things get a little complicated because depending on the source, you get different numbers. Neoplan cited 170 passengers in some configurations. Other documentation puts the realistic operational number at 144. Here's the thing about that 170 figure. Anyone who has spent any real time on a long-distance coach understands immediately why that number is more theoretical than practical. At 170 people, legroom becomes a genuine problem. The kind of problem that turns a premium travel product into something passengers actively complain about. The 144-seat configuration was the version that made it into actual production use. The higher number got mentioned, often in press materials, but it wasn't the everyday reality. There was also a layout quirk built into the design that sounded workable in a design meeting and created real friction in actual operation. The engine placement meant that a clean lower deck passageway through the articulation point wasn't possible. To move from the front section to the rear section of the coach, passengers had to go upstairs first, travel through the upper deck, and then access the rear area from above. It worked. Nobody was trapped anywhere. But it added a layer of awkwardness to the passenger experience that a standard single-unit coach simply didn't have. On a short trip, probably not a big deal. On a long cross-continental haul, the kind of route the Jumbocruiser was designed for, that kind of friction adds up in ways that affect how passengers feel about their experience. There was also a notable engineering choice in the drivetrain arrangement. The Jumbocruiser used what's called a front-axle puller configuration. Rather than pushing the articulated rear section from behind, the drive pulled it from the front. This was a bold technical decision, and the logic behind it was rooted in stability and load distribution concerns. Whether it fully solved those concerns in practice is something the market would eventually answer, but at the design stage, Neoplan clearly thought hard about the mechanical realities of putting that much length under a single driver's control at speed. Now, you might be thinking that all of this sounds like a genuinely impressive piece of engineering, and you'd be right. The problem was never really about whether Neoplan could build it. The problem was always about whether the world the Jumbocruiser had to operate in was ready for something this far outside the established boundaries. And the world, as it turned out, was not. This is where it gets really interesting. The reasons the Jumbocruiser failed weren't mysterious. They weren't buried in technical reports or hidden behind corporate spin. They were visible, logical, and in retrospect almost predictable. The market rejection came from three directions simultaneously, and any one of them alone might have been manageable. Together, they were decisive. Start with trust. Double-deck coaches were already asking operators and passengers to accept a different mental model of what a road vehicle could be. Height, mass distribution, wind exposure at speed. The Skyliner had spent years building credibility in that space, and it had done so successfully. But the Jumbocruiser added a new layer of complexity that reset the trust equation almost from zero. An articulated joint meant more moving parts. It meant a vehicle that physically changed shape while in motion. It meant a driver managing not just a very long vehicle but a vehicle with a pivot point somewhere behind them that responded to road conditions in ways a rigid coach simply didn't. For operators who were already cautious, the combination of extreme height and extreme length and articulation created a mental checklist that was just too long. The vehicle looked impressive at a show. In everyday scheduled service, it looked like exposure to a new category of risk that most operators weren't paid to experiment with. Then came infrastructure. And this is the part that doesn't get talked about enough. European bus terminals, coach stations, and staging areas in the mid-1970s were designed around vehicles with standard dimensions. Pull-through bays, turning radiuses, parking configurations, loading zones, all of it calibrated to conventional coaches. A 59-foot articulated double-decker didn't just need a different kind of driver. It needed a different kind of everything. Space to swing through turns without blocking adjacent bays. Room to execute that 79-foot turning circle in terminals that weren't designed with 79-foot turning circles in mind. Loading logistics that accounted for the fact that passengers had to navigate between sections. If your routes and your terminals can't comfortably absorb the vehicle, it doesn't matter what the spec sheet says about capacity. You can't sell seats on a bus that can't fit into the station. And then the math. The price point. Reports from the period described the Jumbocruiser as costing approximately the equivalent of 2 Skyliners. 2. Let that land for a second. An operator sitting across a table from a Neoplan salesperson in 1975 was being asked to spend enough money to buy 2 proven, reliable, already trusted coaches, and instead put that entire budget into one experimental giant. With one Jumbocruiser, if something went wrong mechanically, your entire investment in that route was parked. With 2 Skyliners, you had redundancy. You had scheduling flexibility. You had the ability to pull one coach for maintenance without losing your entire capacity on that corridor. The capacity advantage of the Jumbocruiser only made financial sense if you could guarantee consistent high load factors across a very large number of seats on every run. Long-distance coach economics rarely cooperate with that kind of optimism. So by the time 1975 turned into 1976, the hesitation was already there. The orders weren't flooding in the way Neoplan had hoped. The scale of ambition was clear. The commercial reality was catching up fast. In the first year of production, only 6 units were built. In the second year, the factory produced none. 0. The market had delivered its verdict in the clearest possible language. And then something happened on a highway that turned hesitation into a full stop. Serial number 4 was one of the more premium examples in the small production run. Neoplan had outfitted it with 80 leather seats and, notably, a bar on board. This wasn't a budget coach crammed with as many passengers as legally possible. This was the version meant to prove the high end of the concept. Comfortable, impressive, aspirational. The kind of product that was supposed to win over the skeptics by showing that big and luxurious weren't mutually exclusive. It was running a long-haul route between Belgium and Spain, which was exactly the kind of service where a vehicle like this was supposed to justify its existence. Long distances, premium passengers, a route where comfort and capacity combined could genuinely make the economics work. On the highway, the coach began to sway. And then it rolled onto its side. No one died. That detail matters and shouldn't be glossed over. Given the size and weight of the vehicle, and the nature of a rollover at road speed, the fact that there were no fatalities is significant. But in the world of transportation, where operators are making decisions about what to trust with their passengers and their licenses and their reputations, the story that spread across the industry wasn't the part about everyone surviving. The story was that the giant articulated double-decker had gone over on a highway in Europe. Here's what most people don't realize about how accidents function in commercial transportation market. It's not just the physical event that matters. It's the narrative that forms around it. And the narrative that formed around the Jumbocruiser rollover was specific and brutal. Operators who were already nervous about the vehicle's stability profile now had a real incident to point to. Buyers who had been on the fence had a reason to stay off it permanently. The fragile thing the entire project depended on, the slow accumulation of buyer confidence in something genuinely outside the norm, collapsed in a way that couldn't be repaired quickly. Neoplan pulled the model from its lineup. They sold the license to an entrepreneur based in Bristol, England, who established a company called Jumbocruiser Limited with plans to continue development and sales from a new base. And the project moved into its strange second chapter. But here's the cruel twist in all of this, and it's the kind of detail that makes transportation history genuinely strange to sit with. Years after the accident, the driver came forward and admitted what had actually happened. He had been handling hot coffee while driving. The rollover wasn't a mechanical failure. It wasn't a stability design flaw asserting itself at speed. It was a distracted driver losing control of an extremely demanding vehicle at a moment of inattention. A cup of coffee. That was the thing that ended one of the most ambitious coach projects in European manufacturing history. And by the time that admission surfaced, it was far too late to matter commercially. The market had moved on. The damage was structural, not to the coach, but to the idea. Now, you might be thinking that's where the story ends. Big ambition, small production run, one accident, license sold, finished. But the Jumbocruiser's story doesn't actually end there. It fractured into a strange series of offshoots that kept the concept alive in increasingly eccentric forms for another decade. The Bristol operation, Jumbocruiser Limited, built 3 additional units between 1982 and 1986. But these weren't factory builds in the Neoplan tradition. They were conversions, assembled from existing vehicles, with at least one of them incorporating a rear section salvaged from a coach that had previously been wrecked. The engineering pedigree of these British examples was considerably different from the original German production run. They've been described, repeatedly and across multiple sources, as extremely unreliable. Over time, only one of those Bristol-built examples is believed to have survived in any meaningful condition. The gap between Neoplan's original engineering ambition and what Jumbocruiser Limited was working with in Bristol is significant, and it shows in the outcome. When you pull all of this together and try to establish a definitive production count, the number most consistently cited is 10 coaches built across the full span from 1975 to 1986. These are commonly identified under the designation Neoplan N138 SL4. And this is where something interesting sits just under the surface of the story. These weren't standardized production vehicles rolling off an assembly line in identical configurations. Each one had the potential to be customized, tailored to a specific customer's requirements or a particular market's preferences. The Jumbocruiser was never a volume product. It was always closer to a bespoke project wearing production clothing. One of the most striking examples of that customization range is the variant built for the Japanese market. A right-hand drive configuration, which required significant adaptation to the core design, and which tells you that Neoplan was still actively pushing the concept internationally even as the European market was showing clear signs of resistance. Whether Japan was more receptive or whether that unit also struggled commercially isn't entirely clear from the available record, but the fact that it existed demonstrates an ongoing commitment to finding audiences that a European rollout failure didn't kill immediately. Then there was the variant that stands above all the others for sheer conceptual strangeness. A car hotel bus. Not a coach designed around passenger seats in the traditional sense, but essentially a rolling living environment. The interior of this example offered approximately 90 square meters of usable space, which converts to roughly 970 square feet. To put that in perspective, 970 square feet is a reasonably sized apartment in most European cities. This thing was a mobile living space built inside a bus body, and it also carries a specific engineering milestone. It was the first Jumbocruiser, and by some accounts the first coach of any kind, to use an upper front wrap-back windshield treatment. A styling choice that would become more common in later generations of premium coaches. The car hotel bus was the Jumbocruiser at its most experimental, its most divorced from conventional coach operation, and in a way its most honest about what the platform actually was. A vehicle so outside normal parameters that its most fitting use might not be carrying passengers on a schedule at all. The swan song came in 1992, 17 years after the original 1975 debut, which is itself a remarkable timeline for a concept that most people assumed was finished by 1977. An 11th example was built, and this one carried a specific distinction. It was the only pusher version in the entire production history, meaning the drive configuration was reversed from the front axle puller arrangement that had characterized all the earlier unit. The engine pushed the articulated rear section rather than pulling it. This wasn't a trivial variation. It represented a fundamentally different approach to the mechanical relationship between the two sections of the coach, and it suggests that even at that late stage, someone involved in the project was still experimenting with the core architecture. This 11th example ran in service for approximately a year before a collision with a truck ended its working life on the road. What followed was a legal process, and then, eventually, the damaged coach was sent to Belgium for rebuilding. And the rebuild is where the story gets genuinely strange from a preservation standpoint. In the process of restoring the vehicle, it was significantly changed visually and mechanically. The axle configuration was altered from what's described as a 121 arrangement to a 112 arrangement. The result was a coach that, by the time it returned to any kind of operational condition, was barely recognizable as an original Jumbocruiser. The lineage was there if you knew what to look for, but the physical reality of the machine had drifted far enough from its origins that calling it a true example required some qualification. Here's the thing about those numbers, 10 or 11 depending on how you count the rebuilt final example. In the context of coach manufacturing, 10 units is not a production run. It's barely a prototype series. Standard Neoplan Skyliner production over the same period numbered in the hundreds. The coaches that define eras, that reshape how industries think about vehicles, typically do so through volume. Through enough examples in enough markets over enough years that operators gain familiarity, that mechanics develop expertise, that passengers build expectations. The Jumbocruiser never had that runway. It accumulated 10 examples over 11 years, most of them in configurations that were specific to individual customers rather than standardized for broad market deployment. And then it stopped. But stopped doesn't mean disappeared. And this is where the Jumbocruiser earns its place in history, not as a commercial success, but as something arguably more interesting. A physical record. A documented extreme. According to the Guinness Book of World Records, the Jumbocruiser holds the title of the largest bus of its time, specifically tied to 1975, when the record claim was established and verified. That title wasn't awarded informally. It was measured, documented, and confirmed against the regulatory definitions and competing vehicles of that specific moment. The Jumbocruiser was exactly what Neoplan said it was. The biggest, built to the legal maximum, size to own the record with precision. And as for survival, the picture is more complex than you might expect for a vehicle produced in such small numbers. Reports indicate that as many as 8 examples may still exist in some form. Not all of them running. Not all of them in what you'd call preserved condition. Some have been converted into motorhomes, which is a fate that sounds undignified for a piece of record-holding transportation history, but is actually a reasonable outcome for a vehicle too large and too unusual for standard commercial operation. Others have reportedly been used as advertising platforms, which is a different kind of visibility. At least one is understood to be in a museum or collection context, and the last known operational example is privately owned. In the most recent reporting available, it is no longer road legal or regularly driven. And here's the thing about that last surviving example. The fact that it exists at all, that someone has maintained ownership of a 59-foot articulated double-deck coach from a production run of 10 vehicles over what is now approaching 5 decades, says something about the gravitational pull this machine has on people who love transportation history. It's impractical to own. It's expensive to maintain. It requires specialized knowledge to keep functional. And yet someone is keeping it. That's not a business decision. That's a dedication to the idea that some machines are worth preserving simply because of what they attempted to be. Now, there's a comparison that comes up regularly in conversations about the Jumbocruiser, and it's worth addressing directly because it pops up often enough to deserve attention. The Cyclops bus from the 1976 film The Big Bus. Hollywood took the idea of a giant road coach and made it a comedic disaster movie centerpiece, and the visual similarity between that prop vehicle and the real Jumbocruiser is close enough that people often conflate the two or assume one inspired the other. The timing is interesting. The Jumbocruiser debuted in 1975. The Big Bus came out in 1976. Whether there was any direct connection between the real vehicle and the fictional one, whether the film borrowed from the actual engineering announcement, is a question worth digging into separately. If you're curious about the movie bus and how it was built and what happened to it, that story exists in a separate video on this channel, and it's a genuinely different kind of rabbit hole. The Jumbocruiser story, the real one, doesn't need Hollywood to make it compelling. It already has everything. The decade of development leading up to a single ambitious launch. The confidence of a builder who had already proven one impossible idea and believed the next one would follow the same path. The brutal speed of commercial rejection. The accident that turned hesitation into a permanent stop. The driver's admission years later that changed the narrative but couldn't change the outcome. The British second chapter with its converted, unreliable, barely surviving examples. The car hotel bus. The pusher variant. The 11th example rebuilt into something barely recognizable. And through all of it, the Guinness record sitting in the background, confirming that regardless of what the market decided, the machine was exactly what it claimed to be. This is where it gets really interesting from a broader perspective. Because the Jumbocruiser isn't just a story about one manufacturer's overreach. It's a case study in the gap between what engineering can produce and what markets can absorb. Neoplan had real evidence that double-deck coaches could work at highway speed. They had done it. The Skyliner was proof. The Jumbocruiser took that proven concept and extended it into territory where the evidence ran out, where the infrastructure wasn't ready, where the economics didn't add up for buyers, and where a single high-profile incident could collapse the already fragile thing the whole project depended on. Transportation history is full of that pattern. The technology arrives before the ecosystem around it is ready to support it. And when that gap is wide enough, even genuinely impressive engineering gets swallowed by the space between what's possible and what's practical. The jumbo jet worked because airports could be retrofitted, because airlines had scale, because enough passengers existed to fill the seats consistently across enough routes. The Jumbocruiser had none of those conditions. The terminals couldn't be quickly rebuilt. The operator economics didn't support the price premium. The route networks that could have absorbed 144-seat capacity on a consistent basis simply didn't exist in the right numbers. And the one thing that might have bought the project enough time to find its footing, the slow accumulation of trust through successful operation, was taken off the table by an accident on a Belgian highway and a cup of hot coffee. What's left of the Jumbocruiser now is a handful of survivors in varying states of preservation, a Guinness record attached to a specific year, and a reputation in coach history as the machine that asked the biggest possible question and paid a very specific price for asking it. It didn't change transportation. It didn't become the template for a new generation of coaches. The articulated double-decker format the Jumbocruiser pioneered did eventually appear in other forms in later decades, mostly in city transit applications rather than long-distance highway service, and without the height extremes that made the Jumbocruiser so visually dramatic. The idea wasn't entirely wrong. The application and the timing were. And I want to throw something to you directly before we close this out. The Jumbocruiser is officially documented as the largest road-going bus of 1975. That claim sits in the record books with specific dimensions attached to it. But history has a way of surfacing things that weren't widely known at the time, and I'm genuinely curious whether the claim holds up under scrutiny from people who've spent serious time in this space. If you know of a road-going bus that was larger than the Jumbocruiser in 1975, not a concept, not a one-off fantasy vehicle, not something that exists only in a press release, but an actual operating machine with documented real-world dimensions that beat it on measurable criteria, drop the name and the proof in the comment. Not a claim. The receipt. Primary sources, contemporary documentation, measurement records. If something bigger was rolling on public roads in 1975, I want to know about it, and I want to see the evidence. The Jumbocruiser earned its place in the record books and in transportation history not by succeeding commercially, but by being willing to go to the absolute limit of what the rules allowed and build something there. That takes a specific kind of confidence, the kind that doesn't always survive contact with the real world, but that pushes the conversation forward even when it fails, because every engineer who came after and thought about double-deck capacity and articulated coaches and the relationship between vehicle size and the infrastructure that has to support it was working with a clearer picture because Neoplan went first. They built the ceiling. They found out exactly what it cost to touch it, and in bus history that matters. Not because the Jumbocruiser changed everything, but because it marked the exact moment someone decided to find out where the limit actually was, built a machine to reach it, and drove it out into the world to see what happened next.